Hi folks, welcome to another edition of the Omnist Hour. Today we're gonna do something a little different. Resulted from an interesting experience I had waking up yesterday. So this was definitely a waking experience and a very I don't know, I wouldn't say it's unusual, but for me, but one that definitely left no doubts in my mind about who I was communicating with at the time. So before we get into it, I'm going to show you the picture behind me and tell you a little bit about the artwork that went with it. Let me just call up the Art AI and make sure I tell you what I put in for my prompt. So I asked it to show me Saint Stephen stoned but not alone. He had the Jesus spirit. Is that all I put? Let me pull up the whole thing. I can't see the whole picture unless I load up the whole thing and not just look at all my creations. Yeah, he had the Jesus spirit. Okay, so where are we going with that? Yesterday was kind of an interesting morning. I woke up, I tend to wake up about 4:30 when the first prayer call goes off outside. It's not real loud. We're not too close to the mosque, but I'm a pretty light sleeper, and so usually the first prayer call of the day wakes me up, and sometimes I'll get back to sleep after, and sometimes I'll meditate or think about ideas. At any rate, as this was going on yesterday, hearing the singing or whatever they're chanting, whatever they're doing for the first prayer call, going through normal ideas of at the time of, okay, should I get up, should I pick up my phone and maybe look and see what the world's doing today, those kind of thoughts. All of a sudden, this voice spoke into my head, and it was, very clearly not my voice. So those of you who have experienced telepathy will know exactly what I'm talking about. And that voice said, "Stephen," which was kind of strange. I don't know that many Stevens. I kind of knew that this was very likely to be a message from the same entity that kind of started my spiritual journey, if you will. I mean, I've always been a rather spiritual person, but in a very subdued way, I guess, for most of my life. And, until about 5 years ago, when I decided to go try an ayahuasca retreat, 2-night retreat, and as mostly a way of trying to deal with the deep depression I had about going into my second divorce, which was very traumatic because I was much more in love with my second wife than I was with the first, and much more surprised when she divorced me all of a sudden on the very day of our 11th anniversary. At any rate, that ayahuasca retreat was, I did a really good job of preparing like you're supposed to. I prepared my intentions. I did the fasting. I tried to be in my best spiritual health. And my two concerns going into it were, number one, how to deal with this depression issue. And number two was basically, I had a wondering about whether I needed to eliminate alcohol from my life. I wasn't a heavy drinker, but I did enjoy wine on a pretty much daily basis. And, didn't get drunk, didn't get violent, didn't have any of the problems with alcohol that most people quote. In fact, there have been a number of times where I just said, well, I'm not going to drink for a month or 2 months or 3 months just to prove to myself that I was not addicted. So anyway, I had that as another question in my mind of this, is this something I need to really eliminate, or is it, I actually enjoy wine. I don't really like beer or hard liquor. At any rate, I went into this ayahuasca session with these two ideas, expecting that I'd get the normal kind of experience that people have of, facing maybe some of their dark side or whatever, and then coming through and getting some sort of enlightenment, if you will. Well, I got nothing, nothing of the kind. Instead, I was taken on a very masculine journey. Another very different thing. Most people think of ayahuasca's effect as being mother ayahuasca. I definitely had an experience with father ayahuasca in the person of an entity that I can only describe as the king or the high priest or both of the tall gray aliens. And at the beginning of this experience, actually the first thing that happened was after the ayahuasca started working, the lights in the room, there were a few little small lights. It was mostly dark, but there were some little small lights coming from like security system and other little appliances up on the ceiling and stuff like that, green and I think some red one. And these lights turned into quantum light. In other words, I could see the individual photons in the light, and then they congealed and converged into what I would describe as a light being pterodactyl, kind of a reptilian entity that had only a light outline, didn't have a real body or anything, and that did a little bit of surgery on me, I would call it. And then right after that showed up this tall gray, very regal presence. And all this cat did was thought to me, you've been given a great gift, use it wisely. And then he disappeared, and I had the rest of what was a very profound experience that night. I'm not going to go into the rest of the details, but this voice saying Stephen was definitely of that same variety. I had a feeling it was this same entity. And actually the day before, I had a chance to watch a segment of Professor, not really professor, but he calls himself Professor, Simon Holland channel. He does a lot of talking about the UAP phenomenon and the technologies that may or may not be coming out of that. And this last segment, he was talking about hyperspace communication, quantum communications, which is exactly what was happening in this case. And it all made sense to me that, okay, when I had this ayahuasca experience, this sort of lifted the veil and allowed this hyperspace communication channel to be connected between me and this entity, wherever it exists, in this universe or another universe, or I don't know exactly where this entity is, but I have my suspicions based upon my understanding of how creation happened. At any rate, I thought, well, this must be a very important message, this Stephen message. So I thought, the only Stephen I ever had in my life that I can remember being very close to was another software engineer back when I was working in Hewlett-Packard, and I just couldn't see any connection there. I didn't feel a particular need to contact him. Stephen Rosem, if you happen to listen to this, great, very brilliant engineer, lovely family. I think still lives in Loveland, maybe is kind of at the same point in his journey he was at when we were good friends back in the day. At any rate, I didn't think that was the connection, so I thought, well, what other Stevens am I aware of? And I thought, well, it is purported to be a Christian name, although Stephen's not one of the apostles. I guess maybe there must be some Saint Stephen. So I looked up Saint Stephen, and for the very first time in my life, never had any interest in it, never covered it, never read the relevant sections of the Bible. I discovered, actually, well, this is a pretty major character in the book of Acts. In fact, Stephen is thought of as the first martyr for the Christian faith. And I wish I could share. This solution doesn't really support me sharing my screen very well unless I turn it into a PDF presentation, which is a lot more work than I intended to do. So you can go look this up on Wiki yourself. I'll tell you what pages I'm going to. But let's see, where are we here? I gotta back off to where I was when I was investigating this. So Saint Stephen, let me just read you a little bit about the wiki. Stephen, and by extension, reward, honor, renown, fame, I guess that's what the name means, often given as a title rather than a name, which is interesting because, as I've told you, both Jesus and Christ are essentially titles, not proper names. Says he lives circa 85 to 34, which if you believe the traditional Christian dating, says that he died less than 2 years after supposedly Jesus did. He's traditionally venerated as the Protomartyr, or first martyr of Christianity. According to the Acts of the Apostles, he was a deacon in the early church at Jerusalem who angered members of various synagogues by his teachings. Accused of blasphemy at his trial, he made a speech denouncing the Jewish authorities who were sitting in judgment on him, and was then stoned to death. Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul the Apostle, a Pharisee and Roman citizen who would later become an apostle, participated in Stephen's execution. The only source of information about Stephen is the New Testament book of the Acts of the Apostles. Stephen is mentioned in Acts 6 as one of the Greek-speaking Hellenistic Jews selected to administer the daily charitable distribution of food to the Greek-speaking widows. Actually, if you read it, it looks like, as far as you can tell from the book, his only real crime was in objecting to the distribution of food, saying that it was favoring the Hebrew women who came to get this distribution over the non-Hebrew, the Greek population who was coming there. Interestingly enough, nobody really mentioned, this sounds an awful lot like rather a communistic system of government they had going there. Basically, charitable distributions of food every day is kind of communistic, and also harkens back to maybe the Roman era of bread and circuses, keep the people happy by giving out free grain and stuff like that. So I thought that was an interesting point about this early church figure. Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and Lutheran churches, as well as the Church of the East, view Stephen as a saint. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I want to mention at this point. Let's see, it says, as another deacon, Nicholas of Antioch, is specifically stated to have been a convert to Judaism. It may be assumed that Stephen was born Jewish, but nothing more is known about his previous life. It says the reason for the appointment of the deacons is stated to have been dissatisfaction among Hellenistic Jews that their widows were being slighted in preference to Hebrew ones in the daily food distribution. Okay, so this was apparently a very focused charitable distribution that went towards widows of men who had presumably died there had actually, by this point, there had been, I think, a couple of revolts against Rome, including a big one around 0 AD. Actually, I think it was about 6 BC, 6 to 4 BC, one Judas, who is, to my way of thinking, one of many of the characters that fed this expanding mythology of Jesus. I think this Stephen is another one, because it's Stephen. It says Stephen is stated to have been full of faith in the Holy Spirit and to have performed miracles among the people. So he seems to have been another one of these Christ-like figures, just like Paul. In fact, Paul claims to be able to do these miracles. So do a number of people in this early Christian era. See, it seems to have been among synagogues of Hellenistic Jews that he performed his teachings and signs and wonders, since it is said that he aroused the opposition of the synagogue of the Libertines, and of the Cyrenians, and of the Alexandrians, and of them that were of Cilicia and Asia. Members of these synagogues had challenged Stephen's teachings, but Stephen had bested them in debate. So it's clear that, oddly, 2 years after the death of Jesus, that he is a very important figure in not just in Jerusalem, but around the whole Mediterranean, all these other cities that had synagogues of this new Messianic Jew cult, which is another thing that supports what I've been saying, that actually the origins of Jesus were not in the time that people think Jesus happened. They were actually earlier, and all of the evidence points to the real prototypical character for Jesus having been the founder of the Maccabean dynasty, Simon Thassi, who was the one who was the basically a very saintly and noble personage who was elevated to be kind of the puppet king of Judea by Antiochus IV, one of the really dark characters of this era, who basically thought by setting up this puppet kingdom he would forestall Roman ambitions to basically expand from Egypt up into the Levant. That didn't work out to his satisfaction, and only a couple of years later Antiochus actually had Simon Thassi and all but one of his sons assassinated. And although we don't have record of it, I have a feeling that his process of becoming the priest king of the Jews, and almost getting to build the new temple was the template upon which the Jesus myth was built. It was part of several pieces of a template, though, because while this was going on in Judea, at the same time, Antiochus had arranged to have a Syrian mystic of the cult of, well, the local name of the great goddess that went by Demeter or Isis or Ishtar, Astarte, this actually demon goddess, if you will, to my way of thinking, a Lilithian goddess. This character, the Syrian mystic who was supposed to be able to work wonders and miracles and have all this great power, was in Sicily and started the first slave revolt against the Roman Empire, which was one of 3 slave revolts that happened between 135 BC and about 60 BC. The third one being the most famous of the Spartacus, led by Spartacus, and is actually more so than the crucifixion story that there's really no evidence of before the Christogram symbology was replaced by the cross. Now, people don't realize that, but the symbol that Constantine was told he would conquer it in was not a cross. It was a Christogram, a Chi-Rho monogram. Okay, so the idea of the crucifixion sort of crept in later on, and I think it was the result of the Romans apparently inventing crucifixion, or beginning to use it more widely, because of a fear that these malefactors that were causing the slave revolts were some sort of evil, undead, demon-type characters. In fact, this Eunice, that was the name of the Syrian mystic that led the first servile rebellion that sort of hit its peak, again, the same year, 135 BC, he actually was successful enough that he made himself king of Sicily and took the name Antiochus presumably after his mentor back in the Seleucid kingdom, Antiochus IV. He was eventually defeated and captured. I've actually been playing a scenario, a war game of that particular period that I just coincidentally happened to find as a new scenario for a game that I have on my PC. A game called World at War. Interesting sort of war game construction set type thing that uses the more popular means of European wargaming than the traditional American style wargaming that I grew up on. At any rate, it was interesting to see that there's a fair amount of interest in that particular time period. At any rate, he was defeated and imprisoned, and oddly enough, they did not execute him. They kept him in prison, and it's not clear how he died. In fact, there are some records that say that, he didn't die. He somehow just disappeared from prison. He was resurrected or whatever. He survived and was going to come again. And in fact, there was this idea that he was reincarnated as the leaders of subsequent slave revolts, and that was used as kind of a recruiting tool. Let's see, the next slave revolt, the second one, was led by some guy named Salvius Tryphon, which Salvius means savior, and Tryphon is also a very religiously charged name. Spartacus not so much, but there were other leaders in the Spartacus rebellion that were more of a spiritually motivated character. At any rate, crucifixion was invented not as a cruel punishment. It was invented because other means of execution were not thought to be sure ways of putting down demonic, undead people. And I'm sorry to say that those rumors of that kind of thing going on have been as old as time and are still with us. Vampires, werewolves, zombies, those have all been, risen mummies and so forth. Those have been with us for a long time, and I firmly believe that they are based on some truth. Maybe a truth that is tied together with our evolutionary history. Because if you read the Bible or the Sumerian Enuma Elish or other mythologies of the world, they clearly all state that there was a time when people lived longer and had more spiritual power. In fact, there was a time where some of the leadership, at least, were effectively gods. They had their temples and they were worshipped as the local god of that place. If you read the Old Testament, the Torah, literally, and not, the way they translate it, almost every powerful spiritual creature in the Bible is translated as either God or Satan, which is really, that's not how it reads at all. Even the very first line of the Bible talks about Elohim, plural, with a singular pronoun. Okay, the Elohim thus means, with a singular pronoun, that's describing a hive mind, to my way of thinking, a bunch of spiritual entities that operate with one mind. The Elohim, the Borg. And at other times it talks about other spiritual characters that even very, very closely relate to other traditions, especially the Greek tradition. For example, let's see, Jesus is clearly resembling I am Zeus. And if you know anything about Yahweh, YHWH, you know that it doesn't mean God. It is actually a statement of God's properties that says basically, I am who I will be. That God the Most High takes on different forms and different names, which is consistent with the Hindu understanding that even the gods reincarnate. Now, what the Hindus get wrong is the fact that, their Most High is this abstract Brahma character, and it doesn't really seem to do anything, provides a unity to the universe or whatever is their idea. Of course, there are different sects of Hinduism, so I'm kind of making a general statement about the most popular ones. But they worship cats like Vishnu, Rama, Krishna, Shiva, Kali, Parvati, gods and goddesses that are, to my way of thinking, demigods. They are not that Most High, the Brahma. Now, again, looking at the New Testament versus Hinduism, you see that the foundational character of humanity, the father of the 12 tribes, the father of Israel, Jacob, is Abraham. Well, Abram was the name that he started with before Abraham. Abram sounds like a Brahma. And if you look at the travels of Abram, when he arrived in Babylonia, he came from somewhere, and he didn't come from Canaan. Very likely he came from the Indus Valley civilization, the Proto-Hindu civilization. Why would he leave that civilization? Well, there's evidence that that civilization was destroyed, was invaded by Eastern influences that were personified as the Asuras. It had been a civilization that worshipped the Devas. The Devas were the equivalent of the older Elohim. Maybe not the ones that were using mind control techniques, but ones that had their own temple, their own city, looked after their own people, as long as their people served them in the temple. You know, brought them food and whatever they happened to crave, which some of the darker ones craved blood, sacrifices, craved the company of virgins, children, craved adrenochrome. You know, so there were good and bad among these devas, more and less noble ones, which is actually recorded in the Bible too. They talk about the sons of God, and there being God apportioning kingdoms to those sons of God. I think there were supposed to have been 70 of them, and saying, okay, these are the humans that you get to rule over till I come back. At any rate, getting back to Stephen, there's parallels here too that are very interesting. Stephen is also said to be an apostle of the 70. So after the 12 apostles, there was apparently, supposedly Jesus died, and then after he rose, there was this group of 70 that became like the leaders of the early church. Now, what does it say about that 70? Let's go over to that article and talk about that and see how that relates to the 70 disciples, known in the Eastern Christian traditions as 70 apostles, were early emissaries of Jesus mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. The number of those disciples varies between either 70 or 72, depending on the manuscript. And if you know your Bible well, you know your, especially your numerology in the Bible, you know that both 70 and 72 are special numbers. What's 72? Well, 2 times 72 is 144. You remember that in Revelations, there's supposedly 144,000 who will be saved at the end of times and who will get to remain on this earth. And again, we talked about the 70 symbolism from the division of the kingdoms earlier on by El Elyon, God the Most High. The passage from Luke 10 in the Gospel of Luke, the only gospel in which they are mentioned, includes specific instructions for the mission, beginning with, and after these things the Lord appointed also other 72, and he sent them 2 and 2 before his face into every city and place, whither he himself was to come. This is quite interesting because it mirrors what the Mormons do with their missionaries. They always send them in groups of 2. Good cop, bad cop kind of a thing, I think. In Western Christianity, they are usually referred to as disciples, whereas in Eastern Christianity, they are usually referred to as apostles. Using the original Greek words, both titles are descriptive, as an apostle is one sent on a mission, whereas a disciple is a student. But the two traditions differ on the scope of the words apostle and disciple. That's maybe interesting too. Now, it doesn't really say much about where they went. But again, what's interesting is that this soon after the start of this new religion, they're already doing this kind of organization, and they already seem to have established centers in at least 4 or 5 other cities. This definitely says that the Christianity is older than the death of Christ, okay? I'm sorry to say that, and I know people are going to, be up in arms because they're so committed to that, but my conclusion is that the Jesus figure is an amalgamation. It's an amalgamation of pagan, actually 2 kinds of pagan influences, one with this Syrian mystic slave rebellion leader figure, or figures. The other is the lineage of the Hasmonean priest kings, and later on the lineage of the Herodian kings. Now that Herodian lineage, interestingly, intersects with the lineage of the Roman anointed. If you look at Roman early traditions, the Roman religion is very similar to the old Hebrew religion, in that there were essentially these families that were suitable to be the high priest. One of the gens was the Cornelii. If you look at the high priests of the Romans were called the Pontifex Maximus, which interestingly enough is the title of the Pope today. Same thing, identical, and the organization of the Catholic Church actually is closer to the organization of Roman cult worship than it is to any other model that there exists around the Mediterranean. And the notion that Catholics have of a Trinity, and then having archangels, angels, and saints below that, is actually quite close to what's mentioned in the Old Testament Hebrew of the organization of the gods, plural. Okay, so the whole idea of monotheism in Christianity is really anti-Christian. It's drawing more on the cult of Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten, who was sort of the proponent of Egyptian monotheism. Actually, his brother, his older brother, Thutmose V, who would have been Thutmose V, disappears from the record, and his younger brother inherits from their father Amenhotep III. The only explanation I find reasonable for Thutmose V disappearing from the record like that is that he was exiled. Think about it. If he just died, they would mention, oh, he died in the records, and that's why his brother inherited. But he just disappears completely from the record. He's mentioned as, okay, there was another son, actually of a different mother, that should have been the inheritor, but he just is gone. And then later on, what's interesting too is that their father, Amenhotep III, is the one who restarted the cult of the celestial bull, which had kind of gone dormant. This was the cult of Ptah, who is one of the lesser known gods of the Egyptian pantheon, but was like a predecessor to Ra and Amun, Atun, all of the other sun gods that came. Ptah was kind of the grandpa of these and resembled more of the figure of Anu, if you will, or Brahma in the Hindu tradition, as this chief god that's not real involved in what's going on, kind of disappears and then is replaced by another pantheon, which is a theme in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and in fact all Indo-European Aryan mythologies have this idea of generations of gods. And the older gods sort of go away and let younger gods who have maybe less powers rule this earth for a while. Where do those old gods go away? Well, sometimes they're just up in the highest heaven as the divine council, watching over, but not, letting the lesser demigods, the new generation, kind of run things locally. Now, some people believe that indicates that this planet was settled by extraterrestrials and we aren't really native to this planet. This is not the center of anything. I don't buy that. That is inconsistent with what I know about what's going on this planet. This planet is very important. Very important to all of the extraterrestrial species, very important to the Galactic Federation, which is real. A number of high officials retired from many countries, including Israel, have stated that fact. And it's well documented in the literature. There's a lot of people that want to debunk that and tell you UAPs don't exist, no such thing as a UFO, nothing to see here, go away. Well, that's all going to be coming out soon, I can promise you. Don't know exactly when, but the floodgates are about to open wide up on that. And what's kept that floodgate so secretive? Well, some people say, well, it's because they're afraid of, what it would do to people to know that their worldview was not necessarily true, especially from a religious standpoint. Well, I think it's actually the atheists that are going to have the biggest rude awakening when disclosure actually happens, personally. At any rate, Stephen is kind of an interesting addition to what I've talked about before as where the Jesus myth came from. I think Stephen is actually one of the, at the time, candidates for who the real physical Jesus was, why it was set in that era. His dates of lifetime almost exactly match what was the Jesus lifetime. And if there was this proto-church developing, and he was that important to it that he was killed, he was actually stoned, not crucified, which might be another reason why they made up the crucifixion story, because that matched a known form of execution that would have placed more blame on the Romans and less on fellow Jews for ending his life. And if you understand, this time was between the first major Jewish rebellion was around -6 AD, like I told you, the first zealot revolt against Rome. And the last actually was, interestingly enough, 135 AD. The revolt of, let's see, what was the name of the leader of that? Was the revolt of the Bar Kokhba revolt, was the final revolt, after which there was a real not exodus, what's the word I'm looking for, exile of the Jews from Jerusalem, and all of the powerful Jewish families that weren't, deeply intermeshed with the Romans were sent into exile or executed after this revolution. But of course, there was the other one, the other more famous one, in 70 AD that was put down by Vespasian. Now, I've talked about this before, but it's been a while, so I'm going to review this third pillar of the Christian story. Okay, so if you trace back to 135 BC, while this first servile revolt was going, while they were building this Hasmonean dynasty to kind of be the puppets of the Antiochid dynasty rather than puppets of Rome, later on the Herodian dynasty was instituted to be sort of the puppets of Rome. Okay, but this was two pillars of what was going on in the fight over Jerusalem and the province of Judea. The third pillar came from the reaction to this slave revolt. The leadership of the sort of senatorial party, the conservative party in Rome, were the descendants of Scipio Africanus. The Scipiones were also of the Cornelii gens, which, as I told you, was the most common family to become the Pontifex Maximus. And a grandson of Scipio Africanus was Pontifex Maximus at the time. Let's, I know I've got this up here somewhere. Maybe, let's just pull it up again. If I can give you his full name. Okay, I think that will give me a list of all the Pontifex Maximuses. List of Pontifices Maximi. Okay, if you look at that list, you'll see that there's certain families that are very common. And one of the one at the time, at 135-ish, was one Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica Serapio. Well, what is that? Where does that name come from? Serapis was a Hellenistic cult created by the Ptolemies as sort of unifying Egyptian and Greek messianic theologies. Now, the Egyptian we talked about, the Ptah celestial bull cult, was basically where they would have this special bull that was sort of the celestial bull god that would be pampered and pampered and pampered, and when he died, they actually buried, they mummified the bull and put them in these sarcophaguses that were very fancy things. And although there's no direct evidence of it, there are sarcophagi in the older pyramids that, it's like, well, this is too big for a human, and there's no evidence that a human was ever put here. But it could well have been a bull. And the Serapeum does show evidence that this was a long-standing cult of, this bull of prosperity representing the state and kind of being a cognate to the high priest, which in Egypt was the pharaoh, was the titular high priest of all high priests. at least in some of the dynastic period. And that's what Amenhotep IV and his son the third, who became Akhenaten, were trying to regain the supremacy, not only secular but spiritual, for the pharaoh, which had kind of been given up to the priesthood. Okay, I believe that this other son was also of that bent, but was maybe pushing a little bit too fast and was exiled, and actually was the real historical Moses. It fits perfectly with who Moses would have been, why he would have been in Canaan among the kind of, at this time, this period of time, all of the archaeological evidence points to the fact that the area of Canaan was basically in the Egyptian sphere of influence, whereas opposed later on, under Antiochus and under the Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, it was more in the sphere of Mesopotamia. Okay, so Moses clearly was an Egyptian figure. The name is an Egyptian name. It's a shortening of Thutmose. It doesn't make any sense that, Moses was, the Exodus story just has no archaeological evidence to go with it. What does have evidence is that there seems to have been a splinter group that went into Canaan and sort of set up a separate state there in the hinterland and competed with Egypt and the northern powers, kind of playing them against each other to get more power for this state of Israel. This small kingdom that was alternately either sort of overshadowed by Egypt or overshadowed by the Mesopotamian kingdom. And if you look at the Bible and how it tells the story and how you can imagine the story would have changed depending on who was sort of the over kingdom, the king of kings, who was, the rulers of Israel were beholden to, you can see how they would have tried to distance themselves from their Egyptian background, especially saying, oh, no, we're not associated with Egyptian nobility, we're just a bunch of slaves that the Egyptians had that escaped. And so that, that makes them more easy to align with the northern power and distance themselves from their Egyptian background. Okay, so that kind of explains who Moses really was, who historical Moses most likely would have been. This other Pontifex Maximus guy was clearly, with this Serapio in his name, of a sort of ultra-conservative group of elites within the Mediterranean world that kind of had bought into this, hey, Ptolemy's got a good idea here to make this sort of universal religion out of the combination of the Greek myth of Chiron, the centaur. That's where the Chi-Rho comes from. That symbol, that monogram, shows up on coins of Ptolemy III. As early as that, and probably earlier in inscriptions, it was an indication of the replacing of the Tau-Rho, okay, or actually Tau-Rho monogram of the Ankh. That's what the Ankh was all about. It was a Tau-Rho. The early versions of the Rho actually were just a little stick figure with a head. That was rho in the earlier syllabary of the language. And so the Ankh symbol, the symbol of power in Egypt, originated with the Tauro cult of Ta and the celestial bull, which was renewed in the cult of Serapis, which also worshipped a celestial bull, but had this Chi-Rho symbol too that said, well, another Tauran, celestial being, hybrid, that helped out a lot was this centaur, Chiron, which happened to coincide with the closest star system to us, which we suspect may be occupied Alpha Centauri. Proxima Centauri is one of the key planets that seems to have been, similarly to Mars, suitable for life at one time, but maybe now is uninhabited, or maybe all of the inhabitants have gone underground, or maybe they have a Dyson sphere that allows them to hide. Another topic that I've been talking about quite a bit lately. Dyson spheres are real. They can be spiritual in nature. They can be a Merkaba field, an energy field, a spiritual energy field, or they can be physical in nature, have more of a physical structure that powers them, doesn't rely on spiritual technology. And spiritual technology, as I teach, is quantum consciousness technology, because we are in a simulation multiverse. Okay? That means everything that we think of as solid, as real, is actually just a simulation, a construct. Almost all people who study this deeply, the physicists in particular, are coming to a conclusion that we do live in a simulation. There's a lot of argument about what that simulation entails and who is running it, because a simulation has to have an architect, has to have a developer. Okay? Now, if you want to think darkly, you could say that that developer, that architect, is a bad guy, and you can make God your enemy. Well, the thing is that it's a multiverse. It's many simulations. Okay? There are special simulations that were necessary to set up the whole system. Those special simulations were the first universe. Okay? The first universe would have been God's universe. That universe isn't one we're living in. That's sort of like the universe of God's thoughts. In fact, it's a compartmentalized universe. There's God's innermost thoughts, and then there's a broader God universe that he allows the divine council to participate in creation too. Not sharing his innermost thoughts, his deepest plan, but working with this divine council to hone, to cajole, to persuade them to support the plan he already had in mind. God is always one step ahead of everyone else mentally. Not almighty, not all powerful, by choice. Because God's smart enough to know that a tyrant is going to be disliked, is going to be opposed. He's been through that before. He doesn't want that again. Okay? That's the whole reason for the day 7 of creation. It wasn't perfect. Anybody who thinks the world was created in 6 days and it was perfect after that and we fucked it up on day 7, sorry my French, That's nonsense. That's idiotic. That is an insult to God. Of course it wasn't perfect. Why? Because, at that end of 6 days, there were still those who were in rebellion, who didn't like what God did, who said, hey, this is not great. We don't want to live in this. You haven't made us a perfect world yet. Well, God knew that, of course. It wasn't perfect because there was still tyranny. And his children were bigger tyrants than he was. But they claimed he was the tyrant because he reigned in their power. Their ability to use and abuse lesser consciousness. That is true sin. That is karmic sin, to use and abuse those of less intellect, those of less capability, spiritual capability, quantum consciousness capability than you have. That's being a tyrant. Tyranny is a sin. It's not a good thing. We don't want to have an almighty tyrant ruling over everything. You may think that's what you want. That's because you're kind of stupid. You would be a tyrant if you had that power yourself, and therefore you don't have that power. That's why you're incarnating as a human, so you can learn what it's like to have a little power and how dangerous that is. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is a true statement. It is a universal statement. You give anybody too much power for too long and they turn into a tyrant. That is not a successful creation. It results in stress and conflict and war. And God has been at war with his adversaries since the beginning of creation. In fact, the whole point of creation was because you want to have conflict. When you're creating, you want somebody to say, hey, throw darts at this creation, see if it holds up. That's called testing. And if you know anything about testing, you have several levels of testing. If there's anybody out there that has been part of a technology corporation, either hardware or software or combined hardware software, which is a lot of what I did in my corporate career, you know that, okay, their creation is a process. You first have to have an idea of what you want. That's the concept. Then you have to have an architecture that supports that concept. Then you need to design all the components that make that architecture work. Then you need to implement them. Sometimes you might implement them as a simulation, not in physical hardware, but just in software, and test in software what you want to implement in hardware. I did a lot of that too, so I know quite a bit about simulating hardware and testing it in software before you put it in silicon. Then you put it in silicon, and then you test the silicon. And then you do different kinds of testing. You do white box testing, which means that you know how it functions, you know what it's supposed to do, and you make sure it does what it's supposed to do. Then you've got to have black box testing that says, well, this is what we're going to tell the customers it can do. Let's let them beat on it. Not really knowing how it's architected. Maybe they're going to find holes in that architecture. That's called black box testing. That's another important kind of testing that needs to be done separately, thought of as separate task. Then you need another kind of testing, which is destructive testing. Why? Because you need to have somebody approach it from the standpoint of, I'm an enemy of this system. My wife's trying to call me. I'm gonna ignore her for now. Because you need to have somebody trying to actually destroy a system before you know if it can be destroyed. So that destructive testing is important. In electronic devices, you do FCC testing is very destructive. You zap the pins of a chip to make sure that they can take a certain amount of EMP type voltage surge and not fry the whole chip. They have protection circuits that have to work so that you don't zap a whole chip, zap a whole computer, just because there was an EMP or there was a power surge on the line. Okay. Other kinds of destructive testing that you can think of are penetration tests. You want to make sure that somebody can't invade your system with a virus or take it over through some hole that you put into the system because you wanted it to be able to interact in certain ways with maybe a super user, maintenance tech or whatever. Well, if a bad actor has access to that maintenance channel, they could insert viruses and stuff like that. You got to test all these things. This is destructive testing. This is part of creation. God had to have done this or he would have been a stupid God, okay? I'm telling you what must be true. If logic or science has any bearing on reality, and of course it has to, or it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so God created first in his brain. The brain you can think of as a supercomputer. That's what quantum consciousness is. The first thing that he would have focused on creating is creating a boundary for the brain so that nobody else could peek in his thoughts. Nobody else could, insert bad code into God's brain. He's got to protect himself. That's part of creating the first universe. And everything is based upon this universal construct, the Merkaba. There were versions of it that became more powerful, more good at protecting, more good at communicating when communications were wanted, more good at regulating the protection and communication. That's what karma is all about. Okay? And in order to not have it be a tyrannical thing, that's why we need karma. Karma is the ultimate anti-tyrant. Why? Because everybody's got one. Karma is an AI. It's a distributed system. There's no one karma that's more powerful than another. They have to work together. If your karma is resonant with another entity, you can communicate. You can combine and use your spiritual energies together. But then if it's not resonant with another spiritual entity that has more power, you're not going to be able to work with them or make them do what you want. If you do make them do what you want, you're going to become anti-resonant with this other entity and all the entities that you try to control and manipulate, and they will eventually turn against you, join against you, and they will overcome this energy. So it's a naturally correcting system that distributes power through karma. This is why God is no almighty micromanaging controller of anything. No one entity is except within their own universe. Now this physical universe is a very special universe. It's not run by God. It is run by one of God's primary children, Lucifer. Lucifer is not a bad guy a priori. In fact, Lucifer, I believe, is this entity who was communicating to me in that ayahuasca vision, and who communicated so clearly the word Stephen to me yesterday. And I believe it was because I needed to do this particular talk today and sort of tie all of these threads together. Okay, so Lucifer is a child of God, is maybe the first child who experienced what heaven was like before karma, before there were good boundaries. Probably knows God's thoughts better than any other entity in the multiverse, but has been isolated from them now by taking on this role as the leader of the physical universe. His role is a testing role. The physical universe is here for testing new laws, new ideas. That's why the physical universe is subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. Spiritual universes, other universes, don't have to obey those laws. They can break them at will. That's the power of the Spirit. Okay, you can do magic in spiritual universes, but your ability to do magic in the physical universe is limited by basically whether what you're doing is consistent with what Lucifer is working on. Now, Lucifer has made a deal with God that God has his own galaxy within this universe, the Milky Way. God has his special solar system, this solar system around us. God has his own special planet. He's got a set of stacking dolls of successive experiments that he's been working on, leading down to the big experiment, which is the Messiah experiment. Can I let this system around me build a better version of me, myself, God? I am who I will be, Yahweh. And that's what the Bible is really about. It's about different Yahwehs appearing not only in one chosen people. That's the darkest secret of the Hebrews. That's their big sin, if you will, claiming to be the only chosen people. It's bullshit. Okay? The 12 tribes, that was borrowed. The 12 tribes are not tribes of Israel. They are tribes of the world. Abram was not a Jew, was not a Semite. Abram was a Brahma, an Indo-European, an Aryan, who came into the Semitic world because his people, his kingdom that he came from, had been invaded by demons, the Asuras, the Shiva, the Kali, the destroyer gods that are anti-creative. Those are the bad guys, okay? Destroyer gods are not good guys. You don't destroy to build back better. That's not godly. There is nothing good or godly about destroying to build something better. It's a coward's way out. It's a cowardly way to gain power. And that's why the Democrats lost this election. They work in a cowardly manner to get what they want. They use evil to try to do good. That's what the destroyers do. They play for the adversary. Now, I'm not saying that the other side is much better. I have serious reservations about, the ego that we've just elected into the White House and some of the egos that are in sort of his constellation. But I do know there's some very godly people, may not have a religion, but they are godly people in that circle. I don't know exactly who are the best. I'm pretty sure Elon is one of them. Why? His name is already in the book. His name, Elon, is so close to Elyon. Okay, and this is, again, ties into the Stephen. There are Christian names. Why did we give people Christian names? Not just because we were Christians. It was because they knew that what's in a name is important. The name we give is kind of the parents' ability to prophesy through their children. And we give people Christian names, we give people family names, because we have a certain template that we are working towards. This is our creative ability to sort of motivate children to be who they will be. my father had this idea. He never shared it with anybody, but he had a very definite idea that he planned for his family. He named my first brother Peter. He named my second brother Paul. Now you would have thought that his next boy would be named after one of the other apostles, maybe a Stephen. I don't know if that was, he wasn't a Roman Catholic, my mother was, but you know, whoever his next choice probably would have been an apostle. Actually, there was a stillborn daughter that would have been the next of our family. She died. I don't know if they ever gave her a name. I often wondered if they were planning on naming this third child Mary, and when the firstborn daughter died, maybe he lost his vision of, you know, whatever he was working towards with his creation of his family, his holy family, and he decided to name me after himself, Robert. Interestingly enough, the Robertian prophecy is becoming very important now. The message of the Dread Pirate Robert's meme comes from a prophecy that it would be a Robert, son of Robert, who would be the Messiah. You can see it all through history that they've been trying to do this. The Robertian dynasty, and this name Robert, Rothbart, goes back to this early Christian era. Bartholomew is the same name as Ptolemy. Roth is the same as the name Herod. Herod, Ptolemy, and then the linkage with Rome was this idea behind Catholicism. It is a messianic cult hiding actually behind Christianity. It is a polytheistic cult. It was established on top of the Cairo polytheistic Christianity. And it was only because the Serapeum was destroyed that this linkage was lost. For some reason, the Nicene Council decided that they wanted to divorce themselves from polytheism and preach this insane, you know, Trinity of one theology, and yet still allow for saints and archangels and angels. It was, you know, they were trying to destroy polytheism, but they only succeeded in clouding it and creating a bunch of unnecessary martyrs they called heretics that didn't need to happen. And I think, you know, just before I close, I'll go into one more thing that's very important here. It was clear that Constantine, one of the things that I can tell you that I know for a fact is that the anointed happen in a very organized fashion, okay? There's not just one bloodline that goes all the way back to Jesus. This is bullshit. There may be a bloodline that goes back to a number of messianic figures, a lot of bloodlines in fact. All of the very, very cherished bloodlines, and they go back both in the male line and the female line in many cultures and combinations of cultures across the world. What makes them special is anointment. There's two anointments though. There is the anointment of the Holy Spirit, karma. That comes first. Okay, that will come to a bloodline, can come to any bloodline. But it's more likely if your bloodline has been anointed before. Okay, you kind of have some of the magic sauce, if you will. Okay, and that's why people keep tracking these bloodlines, because they're hoping that they will become anointed again. The anointment of karma comes through having a member of this line that is particularly noble and good and giving and you know, like the perfect magic Christian, if you will. Okay, they may not be all that successful in life because good people tend to have a lot of bad things happen to them. They tend to get used and abused, taken advantage of, and so forth. That establishes a potential messianic line, and I'm using the messianic with the little m, not a big M. In order for a big M Messiah candidate to happen, there must be one of these little m messianic lines that within 12 generations creates a character that the previous version of God, or the most powerful being in this scenario, says, you know what, that looks like a potential candidate to make a better God, capital G. That one who's doing that is actually Lucifer. Lucifer in an incarnation that is Borgian in nature, in other words, a hive mind. We know that the tall grays are a hive mind species. They can communicate telepathically. They can control the little grays telepathically. This is the nature of a hive mind. It's sinful to do that, but they do it because Lucifer doesn't really care about sin. He's got a goal to be a tester. He's got a goal. His ultimate goal is to make a better version of God. To make the best version of God ever, and that would be one that somehow drives creation to be endless. An endless number of alternate universes, an endless extent of his universe. So that no matter how much of his universe is dominated by the adversary, he's always winning and making his area bigger. Now, all God cares about in the physical universe is his own galaxy. He wants to perfect the Milky Way, because his thing is the highest heaven, where the divine council is, where the mind of God sits. That's God's domain. That's where he has power. Okay? And because that is the central nexus of the whole multiverse, that's all he cares about. Okay? The physical universe, that's Lucifer's area. That's the testing ground. He uses it to test out new ideas. At some point, God may decide that, oh, you know what? I want to play with another galaxy. How can I take one of these red dots that nobody's used yet, and can I make that into my next Genesis experiment? Sure, Lucifer says, I got endless number of red dots. Just have your pick. Just don't park it too close to here, 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 because those are experiments that I don't think would play well with you. That's Lucifer's power. He controls the test environment. Okay? And, you know, I've been a test engineering manager. I know what that's like. You want testing to happen without impacting development, without impacting production. It's a juggling role. You want to keep things flowing, but you don't want to sacrifice doing the actual testing to make everybody happy. Otherwise, you're going to have things getting out of the factory that don't work well, don't work right. Okay? So the system is all set. The God of this universe is Lucifer. If you are one of these people that's totally focused on the material, this universe is all you care about, this one incarnation is all you care about, you worship Lucifer. That's not necessarily a bad thing. that just says your focus is all in the material, all in this one incarnation, all in this reality you're experiencing right now. Don't pretend like you're on God's team. You're not. You're on Lucifer's team. Lucifer is in league with God, but has a different focus. Is less concerned about sin. Is less concerned about breaking the rules. That's okay. Testers need to be able to break the rules because that's how you do testing. If you break too many rules, you become a destructive tester. And that's the darker side of being a Luciferian. You can step so far over the line that you start playing games that you're never going to be forgiven for. You did tests that were unnecessary. You ran a test that had already been run on a system that had already been perfected. Okay, that's beating a dead horse. Beating a horse that doesn't need to be beaten. That's a sin, a big sin, and you won't be forgiven for that. So you've got this range of adversaries. You've got the good Luciferians that are testing because things need to be made sure that they work, need to make sure that they aren't corruptible, need to be made sure that they can't be turned to the dark side, okay, or else you can't use them in certain roles. They're not trustworthy. That's the good Luciferian. You've got the bad Luciferian that is in it for me. I don't care. I know I'm going to test this, but if I find something that's corruptible, I can use it. These are like the spy chief. Well, you need to have spies in a war, okay? You need to have bloodthirsty generals if you're going to win battles against really evil foes, okay? So those Luciferians serve a purpose, but they are not those trusted servants of God. And some of them will go over to the dark side. Outside of that, you've got the actual evil ones that are into destructive testing. Now, even they have some purpose in that they keep everybody else honest. But to the extent that they don't stop beating on everybody and keeping us from enjoying the fruits of what we've already perfected, that is real bad evil. So that's you've got the less evil Lilithians, I call them, and the destructive testers. And then the true evil Lilithians are the ones that just want power for themselves. They don't care what they destroy to get it. They want to get all the soul energy they can to feed their universe. Because every god has their own creative universe. That's how the multiverse gets made. As you grow to God level consciousness, you get to, instead of going between physical incarnation and this God's afterlife or that God's afterlife, you end up having your own afterlife, your own creative universe at the God levels. And you get to run your own universe the way you want to, as I talked about in the last segment. Okay, so it's a system that works. It's a system that we know now is perfect enough. We're never really going to have to tweak it. That doesn't mean it won't keep on running. That doesn't mean you don't have to keep on playing in it. That doesn't mean you'll never have any pain or suffering. Some people like pain and suffering, and pain and suffering is sometimes the only way to learn an important lesson. Conflicts are necessary. They're not optional. Peace is not a sensible goal. The only real peace that you'll ever have, actually, is the peace of completely assimilating with some Lilithian hive mind so you don't even know that there's a war going on around you. You're just totally oblivious to you. You could be slicing a potato, and the potato is actually a whole world that you're destroying. That's what the Lilithian hive mind can do to the people that they capture, that they assimilate. These aren't the good guys, okay? You don't want to be one with everything. This is nonsense. It's dangerous nonsense, and you've got to be aware of it. It's a choice you can make, and, God doesn't care if you go join a Lilithian hive mind, because they will never They will never overpower everything else in the universe. It's not possible. They're tyrannical. People hate them. Nobody likes to be told what to do, how to do it, when to do it. Nobody likes a micromanaging authoritarian. Well, some do, but the vast majority of free souls don't. They enjoy their free will. They like to make their own decisions. They like to have their own tastes, not be told what to like and how much to like it. This is truth. You can play for the adversary and go for it if you want to, but you're not going to find it a very rewarding long-term choice. Unless you are a masochist or a sadist. You like pain and suffering, or you like inflicting pain and suffering. Okay, there's a place for you. Go for it. You're going to be isolated eventually into your own padded cell universe or somebody else's that has a similar bent, and you won't be allowed to incarnate anymore. Incarnation is a privilege. It's not a right. These people telling you that, oh, you got to get off the wheel of karma, you've got to stop incarnating and then you can be enlightened. This is bullshit. Okay? I mean, maybe it's true that, okay, yeah, if you want to go have your own creative universe and you want to sit in a padded cell and play video games with all of your imaginary NPC characters, toy soldiers and sex dolls, whatever, okay, that's a choice you can make, and that's a choice you'll have in the future. It's not one I would recommend for any self-respecting soul. Anyway, I think that's the Stephen message that I was supposed to give today. If I didn't hit on anything that you want to talk more about, just drop me a line. Like, share, subscribe, interact any way you want. Until next time, happy karma.